Welcome everybody, my name is John Immel. Today we're going to discuss how can yoga complement Ayurveda. And that's what I look like. Let's start with a brief introduction to yoga. Yoga originally was developed as a tool for meditation and a tool to harness the subtle energies of the body. It was part of a spiritual practice. However, over time, yoga also became used for numerous health practices. For example, cleansing and also asana, postures, and doing exercises became incorporated into yoga. They were incorporated in the beginning, but they became more pronounced over time. Historically, yoga was practiced in a one-on-one setting with a teacher. It was handed down from guru to student. In the modern day, yoga may be practiced in a larger group setting, such as in a yoga class. As yoga spread around the world, it became popular to practice it in a group setting. The Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a kind of definitive ancient text defining yoga's purpose and the spiritual philosophy of yoga. And of course, yoga has appeared in a great many varieties since then. And there are lots of people who've commented on what yoga is. But the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali remains the classical definition of yoga. Modern yoga classes tend to focus on asana, depending on the class. And, as you get deeper into yoga, it becomes more and more focused on the spiritual aspects and the spiritual philosophy of yoga. But if you go to a local YMCA, you can expect a class that's more or less focused on asana or the yoga postures or yoga exercises, which I think is what the public mostly thinks of yoga. Many people discover Ayurveda through yoga, and so most of the people that know about Ayurveda heard about it in a yoga class, and a lot of Ayurveda practitioners may incorporate yoga in their practice. So some yogis and also some Vaidyas, they think of Ayurveda as a preparation for the spiritual practice of yoga, or they think of it as a sister science to yoga. And the idea behind that concept of Ayurveda as a preparation for yoga is that first you heal your body, you heal your organs, and then you work on your psycho-spiritual health, right? Your psychological health, your spiritual health, your mental health sort of comes after your physical health. That's the idea there. So let's just compare the two a little bit. Ayurveda studies the organs and tissues of the body. I spend my time contemplating the kidney and the heart and the liver, and I'm always eager to learn more about those organs. What about yogis? What do they think about all the time? The musculoskeletal system and their mental state. The musculoskeletal system and how it relates to the nervous system. It's important to, I think it's fair to say that most people who are into yoga, are focused on their mental state because yoga itself proposes a model for mindfulness, and that model for mindfulness is based on self-observation, and it's also based on quieting the mind. There's this idea in yoga that a still mind or a quiet mind is a healthy mind or a good mind, and that concept is shared by some other Eastern spiritual traditions, and also I think that there's a lot of criticism of that model in Western tradition, in a Western spiritual tradition. So where an active mind may be seen as a more spiritual mind, and that's very interesting to look at the differences there between the two traditions. So yoga outlines a path to enlightenment. It outlines really a path to union with the divine, and I use the word divine because yoga itself has a particular understanding of what the divine is, and so when you say union with the divine in yoga, that doesn't necessarily mean union with the Judeo-Christian Muslim idea of what God is, but yoga's idea of what the divine means and actually is, and that concept of the divine in yoga comes from Sankhya philosophy. So some of yoga's techniques and innovations have provable health benefits. There's scientific evidence that mindfulness has some health benefits, some psychological health benefits. Mindfulness is the idea that you're aware of your mind. And yoga has a specific technique of mindfulness that may or may not have been studied in specific, but mindfulness in general provides health benefits. Stretching and awareness of the breath all provide health benefits. I stretch every morning. I think it's been very helpful for me personally, and there's scientific evidence for it as well. And awareness of the breath, that shouldn't be too much of a stretch. We've all heard that even when we were 5 years old. People say, take a deep breath. If you're stressed out, take a deep breath. Well, yoga studies that deep breath. So yoga can be used to strengthen muscles. It can be used to reduce stress and tension. It can improve your flexibility and your strength, as well as stamina. It can improve your posture and reduce joint pain. In fact, I think this improved posture here is one of the great benefits of yoga. In Western medicine, doctors are always focused on the blood, right? If you have, you're as old as your blood, right? You're as healthy as your blood is. In Ayurveda, we say you're as healthy as your digestion. But in yoga, they say, you're as healthy as your posture. And yoga is so focused on alignment. And really, it's I say this personally. It's helped me understand how to properly align my body. And of course, it's always a work in progress. I'm sure there's some expert yogis listening to this talk and looking at my posture right now and saying, you could probably improve it a little over there. And I can only say, yes, I agree with you. Organizations like the International Association of Yoga Therapists will do research and education on yoga's techniques for therapy. Adding to the scientific evidence of different yoga's different methods. And this association kind of views yoga as similar to physical therapy, or proposes a model of yoga for physical therapy. And that's very attractive because yoga is so DIY, right? It's do it yourself. You do it at home. And Ayurveda and yoga have that in common, where it's this idea that you can use these tools to study your body at home very cheaply and get great benefits. And then, you use you go to the experts occasionally for advice. And that's exactly what I do. Sometimes I go to a physical therapist once a year or once every 5 years even, get some good tips. Go to do a private with a yoga teacher in the community that I respect, and I'll get some good tips, and then I will, be doing some of that practice on my own at home. So yoga therapy requires a special certification, by the way. So it's not like you are just going to start recommending yoga to your clients. That is its own certification. But Ayurveda practitioners may refer clients to a yoga therapist. And I do that as well, although I'll talk about some important caveats and cautionary notes around that too later on as we get in the talk. So yoga therapy it focuses on the specific needs of a specific client. It's not so much in a traditional class setting, but specific consultations and recommendations in a private one-to-one setting. And here you see a yoga therapist doing some adjustments and coaching this person, this client, through bow pose. And this may have been a recommendation for some specific reason. All right, so yoga therapists may provide a personalized plan for an individual based on their individual needs and goals. Right, there could be wellness goals, or there could be trying to heal a condition. They will choose yoga postures specifically suited to a client, and some Ayurveda practitioners that have a certification in yoga therapy will blend the two together in something called Ayur Yoga, which is where you bring in the Ayurvedic practice of assessing the doshas and the gunas of the client, but also analyzing yoga postures from the standpoint of guna. So which postures will increase heat or cold in the body, which postures will provide specific pharmacological effects. And in some way, a yoga pose or yoga posture is a lot like taking an herb, right? Except you're not taking in the herb. It's in fact, in the general order of things, interventions that don't require eating some specific chemical are preferred over interventions that require you to ingest something along a spectrum of minimal intervention to more severe intervention, like surgery is the last resort intervention. Well, yoga and lifestyle changes are generally early stage interventions because they don't require you to ingest a specific chemical of any kind. All right, a personal story from my own history with yoga. And that's not a picture of me, by the way. I never looked like that. I used to fall down instantly whenever I tried half moon posture, which is what's in this picture here. And this went on for several years, and I just always get mad at a posture. And you hear yoga teachers say, if you get mad at a posture, you probably need to experiment with that a little more. And that was true for me. I thought my body was simply incompatible with that posture. But then about 5 years after I practiced yoga, I decided I would do this posture every day for 40 days. And lo and behold, midway through, about 20 days in, I realized I was carrying lots of tension in my solar plexus area, which is that area right beneath the rib cage, in the upper epigastric area. And so once I saw that I was carrying lots of tension there, I spent 5 days just really practicing this specific posture, also trying to loosen up tension in that area and exploring my solar plexus region, and I had a healing. I suddenly had this new ability to control muscles in that region. They stopped tensing up automatically. I had greater control over keeping them relaxed throughout the day, and then suddenly I was like stable in this posture. I could literally move my solar plexus in and out and move that area of my spine flexibly, and that gave me the balance I needed to remain in that posture, even if someone would bump into me. Now, before, I couldn't even do it if I was standing on my own, but then I could move and be bumped while I was in that posture and not fall. And so I acquired some stability there. And about that point, symptoms of pain in that region disappeared. And so, that's just, it's always such a great blessing when you come upon something like that and you learn something new about your body, and then you feel better. Well, yoga is such a great way to study your body. The systemic study of the body through stretching various muscles, through contemplating those muscles, through isolating movement of specific muscles, has resulted in a healing for me many times over the years. And I've heard that from other people too. They say, oh yeah, well, yoga's really helped my body. And I've unequivocally benefited from stretching and from the body awareness I developed through yoga stretches. But I also want to admit, quite frankly, that I found yoga's goal, some of yoga's spiritual goals, harmful to me. The goal of separating consciousness from matter, really threw me for a loop, and threw me into a lot of confusion. Actually, a lot of spiritual confusion, but also life confusion that was destabilizing for me. And so I want to talk a little bit about both of those. Actually, first we'll talk about the postures, but I will sort of share a bit more about this. Why yoga's spiritual focus on awareness was ultimately, didn't help me, actually, but caused me to doubt many things. And anyway, let's go through some yoga stretches by dosha. Vata. What kinds of yoga stretches and postures will a Vata person do? Generally we seek to help Vata become more calm, become more grounded, become more relaxed. So I'll focus on slow, gentle exercises with Vata for about 15 to 20 minutes a day. And I have a lot of Vata in my body. I can really attest to some of these postures. Bow posture, which is featured here in this photo, is not one of the ones that I specifically use because it aggravates my pitta, right? All that pressure on the stomach can aggravate pitta. But Vata people may find that heat supportive. When they put pressure there, they may feel more grounded too. Ekapada Ustrasana, the lunge pose, is a good one for Vata. Anything that stretches those that pelvic region. I love pigeon pose. I mean, it's not listed here, but pigeon pose has been just a really helpful one for me, and I just feel so grounded after it. These poses that focus on the pelvic region can relieve constipation. They can help move the lower bowels. And for me, the benefit that I get from it is really just that it reduces anxiety. I find almost immediately after doing some of these pelvic opening stretches that I feel calmer and I feel more relaxed. So Vata is helped by balancing poses, right? That half moon pose we were talking about before, it helped my pitta because that pose specifically addresses the solar plexus region. But balancing poses in general force Vata to confront their shakiness. It forces them to get grounded. And so they become aware of just how ungrounded they are. So you could think of this tree pose here as an ungrounding pose because you're kind of destabilized, but it turns out that it has an opposite effect because it forces Vata to confront its shakiness, and that allows them to actually deal with it and repair it. And here we see Warrior 3 listed too. Some simple standing postures. People take it for granted that they know how to stand up. But if you have studied yoga at all, you realize that actually standing up, just this simple act of standing there, is actually like hard to do well. It's hard to do a great posture. But as we said before, yoga's great hypothesis is that you're as old as your spine, you're as old as your posture, and so that's a radical claim that we need to know how to stand really well in order to be healthy. And I would support that claim of yoga. So triangle pose is another one, Warrior 2, some other ones that are standing postures that encourage you to feel good and grounded and stable. All right, forward bends. Here we see a picture of wind relieving pose. This woman is bringing her thighs to her chest, her knees to chest, and the thighs are pressing against her lower abdomen, which is going to massage the lower gut. Now you could just take your hands and massage the lower gut too, but you're getting a nice stretch in this one too. So it's calming. It's very calming. Try it out. It also encourages good digestion, healthy elimination, relieves gas and bloating, right? That's why it's called wind relieving poses, because it gets the gas from the inside out, and that's good. Downward dog, child's posture, wind relieving posture are all examples of forward bends. I even like Paschimottanasana, just sitting down on the ground with your legs stretched out and trying to touch your toes on the ground. I found a lot of help from that posture. Squatting posture here encourages release of gas and healthy elimination. What about breathing? Encouraging slow, smooth, even breath. It could go either way with a Vata person. It can help them calm down and ease tension. In fact, it does do that. It helps calm down and ease tension. But it also can cause a person to be dissociated. And this is actually one of the things that happened to me in my spiritual journey with yoga, is that I just became really into the breath. And I just ended up feeling very disembodied after a while. And for Vata people, they tend to fly off into the stratosphere. Their mind kind of can easily dissociate, and so that was not helpful for me either. Focusing too much on the breath. I eventually reconciled the benefits of healthy breathing while avoiding the problems of breathing by focusing on my muscles instead of the breath when I was breathing. And just that return to something physical as opposed to something that was more ephemeral and external, right? Your muscles are in your body, but the breath is not. Even when you breathe it into your lungs, there's a sense that it's, that it's not really a part of your body. It's just touching the inside of your lungs. Anyway, focusing on the breath can be transcendent, which can aggravate Vata. But focusing on the muscles while you breathe brings your attention back to the physical, touchable body. And that, I found, made it possible for me to have some of the benefits of breath work without some of the drawbacks. And also practicing a root lock, and how you do it is really important. Some people, and by the way, the root lock or Mula Bandha is a contraction of the muscles in the lower pelvic floor around the genitalia, and that contraction of those muscles can help a Vata person have structure and feel more grounded. And also the slow, rhythmic contraction, smooth contraction and release of Mula Bandha can also relieve tension for Vata and be very helpful. Pitta. Slow, mindful stretches for Pitta. You don't want to heat up your body. And so you don't want really an aerobic cardiovascular routine if you're a hot, overheated Pitta. So you can just stretch. This is pretty much what I do in my practice. I may do something that's a little bit cardiovascular here and there, but quite frankly, I get my cardiovascular activity by walking in nature, which is very pitta pacifying. So yeah, calming exercise that doesn't overly heat the body for about 20 to 30 minutes a day. And I said twists. I just want to note with pitta and yoga that twists and half moon pose were really the only poses where I experienced a reduction in my pitta. I've heard about all these different pitta pacifying poses, but I've never really experienced a strong reduction of pitta in any kind of flow. Like moon salutation is supposed to be pitta pacifying. What I found is that that practice of moon salutation simply aggravated my pitta less than other flows did, but it didn't actually reduce my pitta because it was aerobic and heating. It's just relatively less heating. All right, so yeah, abdominal focus and twists. This is a great one. This lying twist is one that I do. It feels so good for my pitta. It wrings out the digestive organs and the liver. And I like to breathe in that, just kind of take a nice deep breath and compress and then release. I find it flushes my liver when I do that. And you may do that. Initially, when you start to do this, you may feel this rush of heat and break out into a sweat, and then it will you'll get some cool relief. And especially that's true if you have kind of damp heat, to use a Chinese medicine term, accumulating in the upper GI, which basically means that a lot of inflammation and tension there. So yeah, these twists will stretch your hip muscles, etc. More twists, the seated twists. Yeah, you can read the other ones here. And forward folds. Here you see Paschimottanasana, the one I really like. It's calming to me, but it brings energy down from the head. I tend to have all my energy in my brain. And yeah, so head to knee posture, a standing forward bend. Abdominal lock. I see this on the list here is promoted as being healthy for Pitta, but it could again also go either way. The compression of the lower of the abdominal area can increase Pitta too, but I generally find that it helps to massage the liver, upper GI, and stomach especially, which can cause a release of inflammation. I'm doing it now just to remember how it feels as I'm talking. And I just want to note that all of these locks, Mula Bandha, Uddiyana Bandha, they also have spiritual effects. So you just want to be careful with the locks. Make sure it's the effect that you want. Yeah. All right, Kapha people, they want to do the vigorous, stimulating routines. Aerobic. Get your metabolism, hopping, increase your fire, refresh that thyroid, expand those lungs, lung opening postures, flush your lymphatic system, get those fluids out of the body through the kidney. Agni building postures and a dynamic practice that's cleansing and increases your circulation, that's invigorating. All that is what Kapha needs. So here you see one of the more intense lung opening postures with the arms peeled back here, and the backward bend is also lung opening. So you're really getting, notice the chin is raised here, really stretching that whole upper chest. So camel pose, chair posture, full wheel. But Kapha people hate full wheel because they love to be grounded, and full wheel is a little ungrounded, right? Bridge posture, etc. Twist can also help get things moving for Kapha. The neck lock, again, another one of the bandhas, simulating the throat to balance thyroid function and promote healthy metabolism. The lock also prevents heat going to the head and contains it in the core. So I find that's helpful for Pitta too, that it just calms things down. And here it says lowers the heart rate and blood pressure. Kapha can do really more intense breathing practices like Kapalabhati and Bhastrika, which they're more vigorous breathing breath work. And I find the more vigorous breath work to be, they have a kind of spiritual after effect of that can make you feel a little spacey, but just because of the physicality of these vigorous kapha pacifying breath work, I find them to be not so dissociative as other breath work. All right. So that's some basic overview of the three doshas. Let's talk about considerations if you plan to recommend yoga to your clients. There are some important, or at least one specific important consideration. And so, many yoga classes these days will feature everything from, rock music to rap music, pumping out Madonna, Michael Jackson, or there's even goat yoga and microbrew yoga. So, there's just lots of different forms and flavors of yoga. But classical yoga, as I mentioned, is a spiritual technique designed to achieve liberation and union with the divine. And asana, this stretching activities, is really only one of the 8 steps. And here you see the other 8 steps listed here. Self-restraint, And then practices to observe, the niyama, yama niyama. Then there's asanas, only step 3 of the 8, right? Notice that we have another 5 steps to go. Pranayamas, the breath control. Then starts to get very interesting here. But in fact, number 5, I think, is a particular one that I really had to not practice, which was withdrawal of the senses. And then intense focus and steady mind is number 6. Contemplation and meditation. It's pretty much in all spiritual practices, right? And then this idea of samadhi or oneness or bliss is very interesting. That bliss is equated with oneness in yoga. Anyway, those are the 8 limbs. And you notice that what most people think of yoga is really just limb number 3, asana, which is posture and movement. But the deeper you get into yoga, as I said before, the more the spiritual components are emphasized. So this is the consideration. If you plan to recommend yoga in your practice, we have to respect, in a way, its spiritual origins. And classical yoga as a whole is a spiritual practice. So some of your clients may find that, if you recommend going to a yoga class, they may think of it as similar as you recommending they go to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque, right? A yoga class is a place where where people do practice the elements of yoga spirituality and yoga philosophy. So it's a good idea to be mindful of this when recommending yoga to your clients. So in Ayurveda, spirituality is truly an essential component of health, but the trouble is that not everybody has the same spirituality. And here I put 2 images on the right here. One is Lotus Blossom Clinic, right? Holistic Healing Center. And you get the feeling that, lotus flower is such a powerful symbol of a lot of Eastern spirituality in Buddhism and also in Indian spirituality and yoga as well. The lotus flower features prominently. And so if you were going to this clinic, you're just going to be clearly aware beforehand that there's going to be that there's a particular spiritual orientation of the practitioner. And then in this bottom one, you see here that it's quite scientific. They're looking at some image on a screen, and they're not really saying much about philosophy. Though some would argue that science itself is a philosophy or a spirituality. But you get a very different feel from these 2 photos. And a question that I would like to just ask you to ponder is which are you, right? And it begs the question, really, since we're talking about spirituality, and yoga does have such a heavy focus on spirituality, it's important to establish standards and guidelines on how to talk about spiritual recommendations in the context of a professional clinical setting. So, how do different practitioners deal with this? Well, some practitioners just avoid the issue altogether and they don't have any spirituality in their in their clinic at all, and they just focus on routine, diet, and herbs. But others, like the person in this photo here, we just imagine that they're sitting in what looks like a yoga type meditation with holding their hands in a specific kind of almost ritual posture with the hands there that has a quasi-religious, quasi-spiritual, or definitely spiritual, quasi-religious kind of posture there. And so others, they're going to find it essential to recommend spiritual practices as a part of their practice. And so, again, which are you? Are you focusing on, are you the type of practitioner that's going to recommend yoga, meditation, mantra, astrology, prayer, sweat lodges, going to church, or other practices associated with specific philosophies and spiritualities? Maybe you're the type of person that will want to recommend those things, or maybe you're somewhere in between, where your practice is mostly focused on routine diet and herbs, and but occasionally a little spirituality creeps in there. So here's what I want to say about it. If you're recommending things from a specific spiritual worldview or tradition, it's a fact of life that you may alienate or offend some people who have an active religious life in a different tradition. And it's also a fact of life that you may also attract people who share your ideology. It's also true that some of your clients may just simply be unaware that yoga or a specific form of meditation or a mantra, etc., is a part of a spiritual belief system. And so, in responsibly taking care of your clients, especially if you know they have a different spiritual tradition, you're going to want to disclose that so that you're not sort of leading them somewhere that they don't want to go because, without them even knowing that they're going there. In any case, no matter what your spiritual beliefs in a clinical setting, clients will always expect your recommendations to be based on reason and science, not just a spiritual ideology. And that's just part of the practice of Ayurveda. People don't necessarily come to you as a practitioner for in the same way that they would go to a priest for a specific spiritual healing. So, in any case, be prepared to explain any recommendation you give in terms of reason and science. And, I would just suggest, again, if you incorporate spiritual worldviews or practices that come from a specific spiritual tradition in your practice, just make sure you disclose that spiritual orientation beforehand so that your clients can decide for themselves in advance if they're comfortable with that. And to some extent, even Ayurveda comes from a spiritual tradition. And so, that should be disclosed too. On the other hand, Ayurveda itself, even in the ancient texts, it's 95% of the literature in Ayurveda is really not focused in a spiritual direction, but 5% of it is. And so, we have to take that into account and just make sure that we're being responsible with our clients. So, I do find it helpful to disclose the spiritual origins of any activity that I recommend to a client. If I give them a context to evaluate the appropriateness of a recommendation in regard to their spiritual life, and that of course aids them in making that informed spiritual choice for themselves. So so how do I recommend yoga then? If I recommend a yoga posture to a client, or recommend a client check out a yoga posture, because again, I am not a certified yoga therapist, right? So I can tell them about a pose, but I can't specifically recommend it. So I might say to them something like, you may want to check out downward dog and research it and see if it's a helpful stretch for you. And downward dog is a stretch that comes from the yoga tradition, and yoga is a spirituality. I might say this to my client: yoga is a spirituality as much as it is a method of stretching. In this case, I'm not necessarily suggesting yoga spirituality to you, but I am suggesting you check out the specific stretch, and that will let the client know that, and when they're checking out this stretch, that there may be some spiritual things that they want to review also or research also in regards to it, and they just know what angle I'm coming from. So that's that kind of speech to a client gives them full disclosure. And as a practicing Catholic, I've, just to give an example from another spiritual tradition, I found tremendous health benefits to being part of a stable church community. I mean, it's awesome. There's people who have been there for several generations. It's a stable community, and I've benefited from that greatly. And so, oftentimes I find myself in a situation with a client where I want to recommend, hey, why don't you, maybe, you should go to church too, right? Maybe this would be stable for you. Maybe this would help ground you. It's particularly to some of my Vata clients that can be, it can be really helpful for them to be a part of a stable community of some kind. But recommending they go to church is tricky, right? I can't just, I don't know what spiritual background they have. And so sometimes I'll say something like, I may say it just like this. I found tremendous health benefits to being a part of a stable church community. I don't know your spiritual background, client, but, there may be some, equivalent, stable spiritual community compatible with your beliefs. And that way, by adding that disclosure to them, I'm not imposing my spiritual beliefs on them, but at the same time, I'm telling them what has resulted in healings for me. And hopefully, giving the client everything I could possibly offer in terms of what would help them. So, another thing, if you tend to have a strong spiritual bent to your practice, you may consider asking clients if they're comfortable with recommendations from a certain spiritual tradition as a preface. And that would be like, I know that you are an avid churchgoer. Do you mind if I recommend some yoga postures to you? Yoga does come from a very different spiritual tradition. Are you comfortable with that? And then your client can make that choice instead of you simply making the choice for them. And there you go. So So I've talked a little. I've given some considerations about recommending yoga to clients. I've also talked about some of the specific yoga postures that could benefit clients with a specific dosha. And I've talked about my personal healings with yoga stretching, and I've also said that I haven't had good results with yoga spirituality. So what is yoga spirituality? What is yoga philosophy? I mentioned earlier that, that yoga comes from Sankhya philosophy, which is this, Sankhya philosophy can be basically summed up as this technique to separate consciousness from matter in order to achieve liberation or moksha and union with the divine. So a person's trying to the idea is that, your body is sort of trapped in your ego, your body and your ego are kind of trapping your soul or trapping your spirit in some way and forcing you into this like selfish worldly reality. And what you want to do is like separate your consciousness from that, from that selfish matter, from the selfish body, from the selfish ego, so that you're liberated. And the idea is that this will free you for union with the divine, that you can, have a sort of supreme perspective that's not a selfish perspective, so that you can, operate at your highest ideal. I think that's kind of loosely how one could interpret the goal or aim of Sankhya philosophy. And yoga shares that goal in some important ways. So let's review some specific statements from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, that classical ancient text that kind of defines what yoga is, and how, these, of course, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, it's a 20-minute read. I would definitely read it if you're into yoga, just so you can see what yoga actually is. You can just Google it. I Googled it and printed it off and read, put notes in the margins, underlined things, read it, contemplated, etc. Anyway, so what are some of the main statements from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali referencing these spiritual beliefs that are at the heart of yoga and at the heart of Sankhya? Well, the first one, you may have heard it already, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha, which loosely translates to yoga is stilling the mind chatter or stilling of modifications of your mind, right? There's this idea in yoga that because of your physicality, your mind becomes distorted by reality, and then it starts to chatter and become very active and anxious, etc. And you want to come to a still point around that. That's a kind of basic idea of yoga. But what are some other ones? Here's some other statements or translations. And of course, always check the original. But here we go. See, purity or saucha results in the abandonment of physicality and the cessation of physical contact with external things. that's a pretty powerful statement, right? That purity is the abandonment of physicality. And of course, the Western tradition, spiritual tradition, is going to really take a huge issue with that there is a way for physical things to be pure. There's a concept of purity in a Western spiritual tradition that looks more like wholesomeness and less like abandonment of physicality. Anyway, really interesting statement from a spiritual point of view that purity requires abandonment of physicality. Liberation fulfills the goal of the true self, and matter is transcended, allowing the true nature of being and the force of absolute knowledge to be revealed. Right? So there you see that idea that that once you transcend the physical self, then you're able to fulfill the goal of the true self. And the true self is not physical in nature, but only spiritual. And again, Western tradition would call the true self to be the whole body, mind, and spirit. And in some levels, Ayurveda is also mind, body, spirit too, right? And so they would take some issues with this idea that liberation is even as it defined here is even a desirable thing or even a good thing. And those were some of the specific areas or statements that I got really into when I did my yoga practice, which were the ones that I said before were harmful to me. They didn't work for me. Having a lot of vata myself, that abandonment of physicality was really opposite to why I got involved in yoga in the first place. I was kind of going into yoga to become embodied, not to abandon my body. So that was just this interesting sort of twist that happened midway through my yoga practice, where I realized, I'm supposed to be disembodying, not embodying. And that was, and again, this was my personal journey with it. And, this is what happened to me. And whether I misinterpreted or interpreted it correctly, etc., this is what happened. So here's another statement. Mastery of this meditation gives rise to absolute knowledge of all that can be perceived. Well, that's another one of those really big statements. Am I, John Immel, capable of absolute knowledge of all that can be perceived? Am I capable of mastering the meditation? I don't know. Supernatural powers arise from your birth, from taking certain drugs, from saying certain mantras, from austerity practices or yoga. Well, that's very interesting too. On two different levels. Do we want those? Can we actually attain those supernatural powers from doing drugs or practicing yoga? That's one question. But two is, do we want supernatural powers? Is that, or do I want to develop myself naturally or supernaturally? Of course, I want spiritual growth, but that's really different than having a supernatural power. And so, that's not, I don't see that this statement emphasized too often in modern yoga classes. Like, no, I've never gone to a yoga class and someone said, you will acquire this supernatural power of levitation if you do this. Dr. Lad has referred to that a few times in his lectures. But I think this idea that you'll get supernatural powers arising from yoga practice is presented a little more subtly in modern classes, where they'll talk about your ability to manifest something if you do this meditation or come into this kind of alignment with all of nature. Then you'll be able to manifest your dream. And that touches upon this idea of supernatural powers, or the idea that you will be able to bless yourself by acquire or merit certain blessings through your yoga practice. And there's some interesting theology behind that. Meditation or meditating on unimaginable external thought waves gives rise to maximum disembodiment, which in turn lifts the veil on the true self. Here we see again this idea that you have to be disembodied in order to lift the veil on the true self, or to overcome the distortion of the true self, to get back to the innocent, original, true, pure nature that you had before the moment of your birth. Another statement. Harmony with emotions is achieved when the senses cease to be engaged with the external objects. Here's that fifth limb of the Yoga the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, where you have pratyahara, the detachment or cessation of contact between the senses. So harmony with emotions is achieved when the senses cease to be engaged with external objects, and thus that which is mutable in human beings becomes similar to true nature. So you're taking the changeable part of yourself and orienting it towards your true eternal nature. That's the result of withdrawing the senses and stopping contact of the senses with external objects. Now that's very interesting, that a person's perspective increases by shutting down their senses is a very interesting twist on things, because I've always thought that, improving your senses and improving your contact of the senses with external objects results in having a better grasp, understanding, and knowledge of nature. And of course, we have to do inward contemplation and outward contact, right? And so I would probably, I think it's rational to say that both contribute to understanding, and we shouldn't necessarily overemphasize one or the other. I think harmony, if I was going to say personally what I would believe is that harmony comes from that inward harmony as well as contact with the out and understanding and perception of the outside world through contact. Yeah. So next statement. Once the misconceptions have been minimized, everything that is mutable in human beings become clear as a diamond, and perceptions, the perceived and the perceiver, are melded with each other. And this is what enlightenment is. So I remember Dr. Laud talking about that a lot. Dr. Laud was my Ayurvedic teacher, that I see the tree and the tree is me, is the kind of object of yoga, right? That you kind of look at the external object and you recognize and realize your oneness of it, because all of the external mutable or changeable parts of your nature have been melded, have been perceived, right? You've seen everything in yourself that is not part of your true nature. You've kind of whisked it away or overcome it, and therefore you're free to see how you and the tree are really one. And that's, these are some central tenets to yoga's philosophy and spirituality, and you're going to see all kinds of ways that expresses in yoga classes. And almost every yoga class I've ever been to, I've seen elements of this appear in certain moments throughout the class. So what are some of these central themes? I've mentioned them already. Clarity of perception. That the disciplined practice of yoga will yield absolute clarity of perception and also omniscience, free from the distortion caused by the body, the selfish ego, or the environment. So that's a central theme that goes throughout the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. Very Sankhya style of belief. And yoga is placing that heavy emphasis on self-observation, observing the mind, body, and spirit as if from a distance, almost like a witness consciousness kind of thing where you're looking at yourself from a distance. And so in some ways, yoga is this attempt to understand the true nature of the whole universe through this particular technique of withdrawing from contact with objects in the specific objects in the universe via the senses, and instead entering into a contemplative, transcendent state. I know I'm using lots of big words here throughout this talk, but these are, this is what it is, right? So I'm trying to make it as simple as I can, and at the same time, these are I think these are some of the basic building blocks of yoga's philosophy, yoga's spirituality. But if you find that you need to rewind and listen to it again, or I'll try to explain it in other ways if we need to in class too. All right. So yeah. So yoga believes that this technique, this whole model, will result in an enlightened state of being where one is in harmony with and literally united with and having a mastery over nature. That you are kind of having oneness with the divine reality and therefore have mastery over reality. And that in this enlightened state, you are united with the divine. Because the divine in yoga is all that is, right? And that's very different in the Western spiritual tradition, where God is completely other. God is a creator separate from the universe. So all that is does not include God, which is this sort of separate being outside of the universe. But in yoga and other different belief systems, God is the essence of the universe. And instead of being outside of the universe. And that is, so that some interesting theology there that has some, these theological or philosophical terms appear as if they don't affect our daily lives, right? Or they don't have any meaning in our daily lives. But these different worldviews, sort of crystallize down to our everyday activities. And as a person who is practicing a mind, body, spirit form of medicine, it's really important that you understand how different worldviews affect your everyday thoughts, everyday thought patterns. For example, do you allow yourself to be angry? Anger is one of the emotional states that I think is most heavily criticized by Sankhya philosophy. And people who have a strong yoga practice often feel very uncomfortable with anger or righteousness or any one of these things, these emotions in that area. Does that describe you or not? And so your views on the healthfulness of anger or the healthfulness of righteousness and strength and all these other things are heavily colored by your perception of what the ego is and what the universe looks like and what God looks like. And so, these do crystallize into our everyday behavior. Second sentence here, liberation from the body and the ego, as well as stillness and serenity, are essential features of the ultimate yogic meditative state. So here's another example of how yoga's philosophy or spirituality can be influencing your daily life. Do you have this idea, or do you conceive that God wants you to be still or serene, or that peacefulness or serenity is the sign of your holiness, right? Of your spiritual growth? And I think a lot of people who are heavy into yoga would say, yeah, when I'm still, when I'm serene, when my mind is still, that's when I'm closest to God. Well, that certainly can be a spiritual state, but in the Western tradition, there are other spiritual states that are also very close to the divine too, and some of them are very active and very not still, but instead are very passionate. And so that would be a question that I would ask: is is stillness closer to God or passion closer to God? I think those are really important theological questions that students should ask themselves. Are they both close to God? All right, so here are some practices in yoga classes or in yoga communities that are used to implement some of the above spiritual effects. Yogis may be really into cleansing and strict diets, like sattvic diets or vegetarian or vegan diets, or drinking only milk, or doing lots of enemas, or other cleansing practices. And here we see a picture of just very brightly colored food. And I see that in yoga circles often, that like brightly colored food is a sign that there's a lot of prana in the food and a lot of vitality, so that's what I should eat. I've seen that belief in certain yoga communities. And, but again, Ayurveda would say, well, Vata doesn't need more prana. Vata needs like heaviness, right? But is it spiritual to be heavy in yoga or only to be light? All All right, so some familiar, so Shavasana after vigorous exercise, part of the ritual of a yoga class. Many yoga classes, have a general, follow a general, what in a in a religion would be called a liturgy, right? A specific sequence throughout the class to have a certain spiritual effect. And Shavasana is certainly one of the steps in that liturgy of yoga classes. You come in, you kind of loosen up your spine. That's the first step. And then you stretch your muscles, warm up, etc. Then you get your heart rate up. And then after you've kind of cleansed and gotten your circulation up and worked out all your tension, then starts the more spiritual parts of the class. You kind of wind down into Shavasana, which is part of having a specific spiritual state, and then you might say Om, and then follow that by some pranayama and meditation, etc. It's all part of a kind of liturgical sequence. And so, saying Om is the next step there. And why do yogis say Om? And why do they say why Shavasana? Shavasana helps to induce that transcendent state. It's called corpse pose. Shavasana means corpse pose because you're dying to your body and you are moving into a spiritual realm. And then you say Om, which is to unite with God. This is a sort of climax of yoga liturgy on some levels, although you could call the climax happening at various different points. But this Om is to harmonize with all of nature, to unite with God, the yoga's idea of God. And then you have the breath retention and pranayama. This is to attach from the bodily needs. And specifically referencing that breath retention, if you can overcome your need to breathe, right? Wow, you have transcended your body, right? And that's why some of the advanced yoga spiritual folks talk about having the 1,000-year breath, right? Where you've overcome your physical state to such a degree that you can only breathe once every 1,000 years in a deep state of samadhi, the sort of ultimate enlightened meditative state of yoga. And so this pranayama, and then limb number 5, pratyahara, is to detach from the bodily needs, to detach from your passions, and of course, detachment, has a place in our holiness. So, and then there may be meditation focused on quieting the mind or even emptying the mind. And here's a picture of someone who is a kind of in that serene state of meditation. And you see the eyes are half closed. That's part of your withdrawal from the sense organs there. You see the person's made of stone. They're not moving, right? This is a still, solid, eternal thing, right? And you often see stone statues to evoke that sense of eternal meditation. And it's also very cool. This is not a rajasic, active, passionate state of being with ruby red lips and rosy cheeks. This is a kind of very cool space, often in a garden or something very beautiful, something very tranquil, serene environment. And so all that is part of the Sankhya's philosophy and spirituality. So let's talk about some of the similarities and differences between Ayurveda and yoga, because we have to remember that Ayurveda comes from Sankhya philosophy too, right? Just like yoga, just like Buddhism. And so they share some things in common. In particular, the Ayurvedic concept of balance is a theme that appears throughout Ayurvedic texts, and that points to or has overtones of yoga's ideal state of the calm mind, right? A calm mind is a balanced mind that you in yoga, and Ayurveda kind of has that idea too, that like when you're balanced, you're kind of sharing in the nature of the whole universe rather than in your own individual specific nature, right? But then again, Ayurveda places heavy emphasis on the individual too, which is a bit of a difference from yoga, because yoga is focused on union, Ayurveda is focused on individuality. So Ayurveda and yoga place heavy emphasis on self-observation and personal responsibility. That's something they share in common, right? It's not like a main theme of Ayurveda is pray and God will heal you. No, it's more like study yourself, take personal responsibility for what you've done, and if you behave perfectly, then you'll be healed, right? If you have the perfect diet, you'll be healed. And of course, that philosophy has problems too, right? If you're just dependent upon God for your healing and you're not, participating in your own health by making good choices, well, I don't think God's going to answer that. I mean, maybe he will. And if he does, great, right? I love a free healing, right? But then the opposite of that is such a heavy emphasis on personal responsibility that a person feels obliged to have a perfect diet in order to heal. Well, that can kind of deny the merciful nature of God too. And so, but Ayurveda and yoga tend to place more emphasis on that self-observation and personal responsibility. The Ayurveda chapter on mind very closely mirrors the yoga's Sankhya origins. And so I find the Ayurveda's chapter on mind to actually be really dissimilar from the rest of Ayurveda. And I'm talking about the chapter on mind in Charaka Samhita, one of the classical ancient texts. It's kind of like you're reading about all this Ayurveda, which is so focused on embodiment, and then all of a sudden you get to this chapter on mind, which is about disembodiment. And then after that chapter, it's like back to embodiment. So it's very interesting. I wonder how well integrated, even though Ayurveda's origins are similar to yoga and that they're from Sankhya, I don't know if Ayurveda is as well integrated into the Sankhya model or even follows the Sankhya model as much in practice. And of course, Ayurveda's references to spiritual content are sparse. They're pretty much in that mind chapter and in a few other areas where it talks about the causes of disease being fate or destiny, and having spiritual causes, and the chapters on pregnancy. There's a lot about like spiritual things that pregnant women shouldn't do, like walk near a river at night because there's demons there and stuff like that. So there's other influences of local culture and local spiritual beliefs in some of the ancient texts as well. Ayurveda is generally not transcendent. I mean, yoga is all about transcendence, but Ayurveda is generally not transcendent, other than that chapter on mind. Ayurveda doesn't seem to advocate for maximum disembodiment or purity by abandonment of physicality, or that matter itself should be transcended. Another difference between yoga and Ayurveda is that Ayurveda believes that natural urges should not be suppressed, right? There's that our passions, our desires are essentially natural life-giving instincts, right? Like passions are natural. And passions, in the Western spiritual or more Catholic Christian spiritual view, the passions are seen to be as an aid to, as like the physical motivating forces to get to God. Right? But of course, passions can be overindulged as well. So interesting difference there between Eastern philosophy of passions and desire versus the medieval Catholic Christian or Thomas Aquinas view on the passions there. It's just really worth studying, actually. The dialogue on passion in Eastern philosophy versus the dialogue on passion in Thomas Aquinas. And the medieval Christian tradition are very interesting to study. And I think Ayurveda affirms the appetites, and that doesn't exactly look like withdrawal from desire in the same way that you get in Buddhism, yoga. But I realize that different teachers have different ways of interpreting this as well. So, but it's just, these are worth noting that there's a heavy emphasis on detachment from the passions in the Eastern traditions. And it is important to note that our appetites and passions can be distorted by ama. And so they're not, you can't always rely on them, right? We can't always rely on our passions. I think every spiritual tradition knows that. So although the Charaka section on the mind seems to agree with Sankhya and yoga in some areas, stylistically, I find the rest of the opus of Ayurveda is kind of dissimilar to some of Sankhya's main goals. Anyway, that's something that you can check out too. Just read those texts. All right. So, yeah. So how have I benefited from yoga spirituality? I've offered some of my, like, some of the pitfalls or roadblocks or potholes along the spiritual journey that I've suffered from. But I also want to talk about how I personally benefited from yoga spirituality and a little bit about, where I eventually ended up. So yeah, meditation, contemplation, and detachment definitely helped me learn about myself. They definitely helped me discover lots of tics of my body. In the beginning stages of studying yoga, I really enjoyed, and I continue to enjoy, is observing experiences in my own skin, right? Like a study of the natural world, it's great. And study of my own nature, of my body, great. And I loved that contemplation, moving step by step through my whole body. I'll never forget the experiments that I did with that as an Ayurveda student, when I just kind of contemplated almost every square inch of the inside of my body, or square cubic inch of inside of my body. I continue to discover new things about my body using this technique. And just last year, I studied my vocal cords and mouth tension, and really all the muscles in my mouth area. And like within a month, I had a much better ability to sing. Like I could sing better. And I was, and sometimes people in church will say to me like, "Oh, your voice is nice." I don't know if I agree with them. I don't know if I like my voice yet, but the fact of the matter is that no one's ever said it to me before. And so, I essentially use the yoga's techniques for self-study, and that really benefited me. Yoga helped me understand the relationship between my mind and my body, how I'm like a psychosomatic being, right? That was really helpful. I enjoy yoga's idea of sitting in front of an object, like a blade of grass or a tree, and contemplating what it would be like to be a tree. That Dr. Lad statement, I see the tree and the tree is me. Well, that's a little bit like ungrounding and destabilizing in my point of view. But to imagine that I'm a tree, knowing that I'm not a tree, is kind of poetic and also informative, right? I have literally done that in my study of herbs, walking through the Appalachian Mountains, sit down in front of an herb and contemplate what would life be like as this tree in this environment, or this herb in this environment growing next to a stream. Wow, what kind of gunas would I need to have to defend myself in this environment, etc., etc. And I found that contemplation to be very informative, not just poetic, but also poetic. I love the beauty of that, of trying to discover the essence of something, knowing I'll never get there, being humble, but at the same time trying. It's just a very poetic activity. But as I said, this technique of witness consciousness, this idea of like seeing myself from a distance, looking at myself, it was helpful in some ways, but I also found myself calling everything into question, some basic things, especially on relationships. And I know that there's a kind of very liberal model of relationships in some communities, and like that call kind of everything that I knew about love and stable bonds and all that into question. And I found I was like more hesitant and uncertain and afraid to act, and like afraid of creating karma. So I just kind of like became a little immobilized. And this idea behind yoga that a person's perspective creates reality, that's not exactly true. I mean, we can't change all of reality just from changing our perspective, but Sankhya kind of advocates for that. And this idea that our perspective creates our reality, it just made me feel like I was living in the Matrix where nothing was real. And I especially questioned my appetites, hunger, sexuality, for example. And this resulted in me being somewhat dissociated, right? I almost felt like asexual after questioning every single appetite I had, and that didn't feel healthy to me. It didn't feel right, and so I questioned my hunger, etc. But like I know I know people who are so dissociated from their body they kind of lose touch with these appetites, and I kind of was getting there. I was kind of getting to be in that place. This, as much as I benefited from yoga's individualistic search for truth and like trying to improve my personal understanding of nature and the universe, eventually I found the lack of structure in yoga, like just specific, more like specific, sense of ethics or moral, some specific structure for how to live my life. I found that disorienting, especially in my relationships. Calling into question everything I knew about love and relationships kind of left my relationships up in the air and transient. And it was really like the failure of numerous relationships during that period of my life that kind of led me to seek something a little more stable. And again, maybe that was just a personal experience there or not. But again, I began to hunger for more rules. I began to hunger for more guidelines, and especially seeking stability in areas where my sexuality, my heart, and relationships were concerned. So like, what about this, like, this idea of like structure and rules and all that? And I think this really begs a question, or another area of yoga, spirituality, or a big question of like, is yoga spiritual or religion, or what is the difference between spirituality and religion? And, I think it's a useful point to talk about that. Again, Ayurveda being body, mind, and spirit, we should touch upon these issues at some point in the course. And most yogis I know claim that yoga is a spirituality but not a religion, and that this is what makes yoga universal and liberated, right? That's what I've seen a lot of yogis say. So what is spirituality, and what is a religion? Well, spirituality is the quality of being concerned with the human spirit or the soul, as opposed to material or physical things. And a religion, on the other hand, is a specific form of worship. So spiritual people have been compared to philosophers, right? In a way that they like contemplate the immaterial world, and spiritual people explore meaning and the nature of things. Some spiritual people believe that supernatural phenomena exist, and some don't. Religious people, such as with priests, right? Sort of comparing priests versus philosophers here. Religious people do contemplate meaning in nature, but they participate in specific rituals, ceremonies, and have a specific belief system, right? And so it can come down to this, that philosophers talk about, study, wonder, muse about God, about the divine, while a priest worships a specific God, right? A priest comes and says, like, this is who I worship, and this is who my God is, right? So philosophers will contemplate truth, and spiritual people will contemplate and ask a lot of questions. And priests will give a specific answer. And which is better? Well, answers can be very comforting, right? But only if the answer is right. And questions are really important too. But questions are endless and disorienting also. So I'm not going to, answer that question for you. But I'm just going to say what my journey was like. Is that eventually, as I got deeper into my yoga practice, I became hungry to fill that empty space that spirituality, philosophy, intellectual life, and contemplation alone couldn't fill. And that empty space was something which seemed really central to religion. As much as I love philosophy, and you could probably tell from this talk, and those who know me attest to this because I'm always reading about philosophers, thinking about, as much as I love philosophy, thinking about God was no longer enough for me. I wanted to worship a God. I wanted to worship God. I wanted to get out of the abstract and into the concrete, right? I didn't want to just, think about God. I wanted a relationship with God, right? I wanted contemplation and worship, not just contemplation, and not just worship either, right? I wanted both. I wanted a faith life with a rich intellectual tradition, but also one that I could worship something specific. And so for me, ultimately, the difference between having a spirituality and a religion was like the difference between studying what love is and loving an actual person, or between loving in the abstract and loving something in particular, or like the difference between studying humanity and having a degree in anthropology, or having a friend. a specific friend. So philosophers are universal. And again, I love philosophy. I love universal thinking. Philosophers love maps and blueprints that transcend individual people. They say, how do people work? As opposed to, how does this person work? And so philosophers love talking about the nature of things and distilling things down to their bare essence. And yoga spirituality essentially does that. I mean, you're stripping it of all your physicality, of all matter, of all desire, and you're getting that down to the bare universal essence, the universal oneness. So that's so yoga kind of has that sort of philosophical bent of stripping things down to their bare essence. Priests, on the other hand, they worship something specific. And I don't mean, by the way, a priest in a specific tradition, but priests in any tradition, shamanic, etc. Priests tend to worship something specific, something that has a face. And I wanted a faith life with a face, right? I wanted a faith life with contemplation and with a face. And so, I grew up in an Italian-American family. I value specific people, and as well as all of humanity. I'm equally interested in my family and friends as in the universal nature of the cosmos. So I wanted my spiritual life to reflect this universality and specificity. And so I began to search for something beyond just mere spirituality. And eventually, as all of you know, this led me back to my Catholic roots. And the rich intellectual tradition of Catholicism, as well as that sort of personal relationship with my Creator, Jesus Christ. And so, this was my journey. This is where it went for me. And what's your journey? I'm just gonna leave you with questions to ponder that relate to some of these main yoga spiritual themes, and see what you think. Is stillness more spiritual? On the idea of yoga and serenity, is stillness more spiritual, or activity and motivation more spiritual? Right, especially when directed towards a good purpose. Right, in other words, is sitting still more spiritual, or doing something good more spiritual? Should we follow our passions, or should we eliminate desire? What about in the theme of mind over matter? Is the mind above matter and transcendent, or should we follow natural laws and stay grounded? Is the body spiritual, or is only the mind spiritual? Is detachment more spiritual, or attachment? Right? Is being attached to is being, bonded in love to somebody and attached to them more spiritual, or is being detached from them more spiritual? I don't even mean to suggest one or the other in any of these, by the way, actually. I think that these are really deep questions that we could talk about for a really long time and come up with all kinds of great answers for both. So, on the theme of enlightenment or union with the divine, here's a question. Is it more spiritual to be enlightened or humble? Can a human being ever be God's equal, perfectly sharing God's nature, as Patanjali claims? Is self-development the highest spiritual state, or helping others? In a self-help industry like Ayurveda, we take for granted that self-development is like the path towards God, or is like the most holy and sacred thing that we can do. But what about just simply helping other people and doing things for them instead of, learning about yourself? Is that more spiritual? Here's what I would say about it. As I said, I'm not claiming one or the other in either of these. I've shared my personal journey, of course. But what I'm going to say is that for a lot of these questions, they're resolved in heaven, right? And I don't mean to use heaven in the Christian sense of it, but just sort of like someday when everything's perfect, these things will be actually come together. These things which appear opposites will become the same, right? If we're perfectly well developed, then our body will be a part of our spiritual life. And if we are perfectly enlightened, we'll learn that humility is a part of being perfectly enlightened, right? If we are perfectly transcendent, maybe we will be better able to follow natural laws and stay grounded, right? And so I really don't mean to suggest that that the left side or the right side of this question is the answer. What I will say is this: is that there's a tendency among philosophers to find a great idea, to find something that they like is super helpful, and then claim that you can get to God from just doing that. And I think God's always bigger than that. God is always, and I know Patanjali's aware of that too. And so, as for us, as we are, contemplating and growing in our ability to heal, in our understanding of spirituality and God, we're on the journey. We're pilgrims on that journey, trying to figure it out, trying to see, where it all comes together. Anyway, let's summarize the lecture and wrap things up. Yoga and Ayurveda are frequently practiced together, and they have features that can complement each other. They have similar spiritual origins, despite some really important differences as well. Yoga's aims are musculoskeletal, yes, but really, the yoga's aims are more spiritual and mental in nature. They include these physical health practices, but it's just very clear in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, at least, that all of this any kind of asana and pranayama, etc., is really directed towards a spiritual goal and not just for health. Ayurveda, there are some sporadic references that talk about health being for liberation and moksha and the 4 aims of life, etc. You can find those affirmations of Sankhya philosophy in Ayurveda. But it's like the 1% of the text or the 5% of the text. The other 95%, it really is pretty much focused on health. Yoga's contemplation of the musculoskeletal system has resulted in a worldwide health movement towards practicing yoga asana, which I think many people have benefited from. It's important, whether you're practicing Ayurveda, yoga, or whether you're Catholic or Jewish or Muslim or Protestant, Christian, or whatever tradition you come from, Hindu, Vedic, etc. It's important that when you're making recommendations, if they come from these traditions, that you're letting people know what the origins are, that where it comes from, and so that you're empowering your client to make a good decision for themselves. And I think by following this protocol, you will truly be able to open up your practice to a wide variety of individuals and attract clients across many spiritual traditions. I think that people, because they know my spiritual background, can say, well, hey, John's just saying that because that's from his background. What do I think about this? But if I didn't disclose that, then people would be confused. Where did he come up with this? Or where did he get this idea? And but that full disclosure, again, allows not only my clients, but you, the student, to make your own analysis and see, what is it that, where do you fit in all of this? Anyway, I want to thank all of you. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to yoga. And this, discussion on how yoga can complement your Ayurveda practice, and also my personal story of my spiritual journey with it, going deep into it, coming out of it, still benefiting from certain aspects of it, etc., etc. So I hope that that was edifying and enjoyable for you, and I look forward to our next opportunity. Take care.